We often think of the White House as this pristine, untouchable symbol of American power, a place of gleaming corridors, grand state dinners, and perfectly manicured lawns. But what if I told you that for much of its history, it was anything but? What if behind the grand facade, it was a crumbling, drafty, and frankly disgusting place to live? A place where the first family had to contend with rats in the basement, faulty plumbing, and a complete lack of privacy. This is the story of a first lady who walked into that mess, a woman of quiet dignity and artistic sensibility who looked at the decaying heart of the nation and envisioned something grander. She dreamed of transforming it, of preserving its history while making it a true home. But her ambitions would clash with the realities of politics, and her public project would be overshadowed by a private tragedy that unfolded within those very walls. Today we're exploring the forgotten legacy and the hidden heartbreak of Caroline Harrison, the First Lady who tried to save the White House, only to lose her own life within it. To understand Caroline, we need to step into the world that shaped her, the American Midwest of the 1830s and 40s. This was a land and a time defined by a potent mixture of Protestant piety, a profound belief in education, and a fervent sense of moral purpose. Caroline Scott was born in 1832 in Oxford, Ohio, a town that was a hub of intellectual and religious life. Her father, John Witherspoon Scott, was a Presbyterian minister and a respected professor who would later found the Oxford Female Institute. This was Caroline's world. It wasn't the rugged, unlettered frontier, nor was it the opulent society of the East Coast. It was a world where character, faith, and knowledge were the highest currencies. For a young woman like Caroline, education wasn't seen as a path to a career. That was still a radical idea, but as essential training for her role as the moral and intellectual center of her future family. At her father's institute, she studied literature, music, and art, not as mere pleasantries, but as tools to create a cultured, stable, and righteous home. This upbringing instilled in her a quiet confidence, a refined taste, and a deep-seated belief that the domestic sphere wasn't a cage but a kingdom to be managed with grace and intelligence. It was in this environment of scholarly piety that she met a serious, intelligent young man attending nearby Miami University. His name was Benjamin Harrison. Their courtship was a reflection of their world, a slow, thoughtful affair built on shared values and mutual respect. Ben was the grandson of the 9th U.S. President, William Henry Harrison, but he had little money of his own. He was a determined, somewhat reserved young man, drawn to Caroline's warmth, artistic talent, and steady character. She, in turn, was impressed by his intellect and ambition. They fell in love not in a whirlwind of passion, but over shared books, quiet walks, and discussions of faith and future. They became engaged in 1852, with the understanding that their life together would be a partnership, a joint effort to build a life of purpose and standing. They married in 1853, and this is where the often glossed over reality of their lives begins. The storybooks might suggest a swift rise to prominence, but their early years were marked by significant struggle. Benjamin, now a newly minted lawyer, moved them to Indianapolis to start his practice. The city was growing, but clients were scarce. They lived in a series of boarding houses, and their finances were, to put it mildly, precarious. This period is a crucial and often untold part of Caroline's story. She was not immediately a woman of means. She was a young wife trying to create a home out of almost nothing. There's a poignant story from this time that reveals her resilience. A fire broke out in their home, and while Benjamin was focused on saving his precious law books, Caroline, practical and steadfast, worked to save their modest furniture and possessions. It was a small domestic crisis, but it spoke volumes about their partnership and her role as the anchor of their home. While he was consumed with building a public career, she was literally and figuratively keeping the home fires from consuming them. These years were also incredibly lonely. Benjamin's work often took him away, and then came the Civil War. He helped raise a regiment of Indiana volunteers and served with distinction, rising to the rank of brigadier general. But for Caroline, this meant years of raising their two young children, Russell and Mary, largely on her own. She managed the household, stretched every dollar, and endured the constant gnawing anxiety that every wife of a soldier knows. She wasn't just waiting, she was actively involved in soldiers' aid societies and church groups, contributing to the war effort from the home front. This period forged in her a profound inner strength and a deep appreciation for the stability and privacy of a well-run home, a longing that would come to define her time as First Lady. After the war, Benjamin's political career began its steady ascent. He became a U.S. Senator, and the family's life became more comfortable and more public. But Caroline never truly embraced the political world. She was a gracious hostess and a supportive wife, but her passions remained private. Her painting, her church work, her family. She was known for her kindness and her quiet dignity, but she was not a political animal. So when Benjamin Harrison won the contentious presidential election of 1888, becoming the 23rd President of the United States, Caroline's feelings were deeply ambivalent. She was proud of her husband, but she was stepping into a role she had never sought, and into a house that was, as she would soon discover, in a shocking state of disrepair. When Caroline Harrison walked into the White House as First Lady in 1889, she wasn't just entering a new home, she was entering a national crisis of infrastructure and identity. The executive mansion was, to be blunt, a wreck. A century of insufficient upkeep, piecemeal renovations, and heavy use had taken its toll. The problems were almost overwhelming. The basement, which housed the kitchens and servants' quarters, was perpetually damp and foul-smelling, a breeding ground for disease. The plumbing was a labyrinth of old corroded pipes, and the drinking water was suspect. But the most immediate and revolting problem was the vermin. The house was overrun with rats, in the walls, under the floors, even scurrying through the staterooms at night. The family lived with the unsettling knowledge that they were sharing their home with a massive rodent population. Beyond the filth and decay, there was a fundamental design flaw that made life unbearable for the presidential family. There was no separation between the public spaces and their private living quarters. The family's bedrooms on the second floor were situated directly above the public East Room, and their offices were mixed in with their living space. Tourists and office seekers wandered the halls, and the family had virtually no privacy. It was, as one staffer put it, like living above the store. For Carolyn, a woman who prized order, cleanliness, and the sanctity of the home, this was an intolerable situation. But she saw it not just as a personal inconvenience, but as a national disgrace. This was the home of the president, and it was falling apart. So with the same practical determination she had shown decades earlier as a young, struggling lawyer's wife, she decided to fix it. And her vision was anything but modest. Caroline Harrison became the First Lady to approach the White House with the mind of an architect and a historical preservationist. She didn't just want to redecorate, she wanted to fundamentally rethink the building. She consulted with architect Frederick Owen and developed a breathtakingly ambitious set of plans. Her proposal called for a massive expansion of the executive mansion. She envisioned two new wings to be built on the east and west sides of the original structure. One wing would be a dedicated public space, a national conservatory and art gallery, a place to showcase American culture. The other wing would be a private residence for the first family, finally giving them the privacy and modern comforts they so desperately needed. The historic central building would be preserved and restored as the formal official heart of the White House. It was a brilliant, forward-thinking plan. It would have solved the building's structural and functional problems while formally establishing the White House as both a home and a national museum. In early 1891, she and Owen proudly presented these architectural drawings to the Congressional Committee in charge of public buildings. They argued their case passionately, explaining the urgent need for the renovations. But Congress was skeptical. The price tag was enormous, and in an era of fierce partisan politics, spending a fortune on the president's palace was seen as a political liability. The plans were ultimately rejected. We don't have a direct quote from Caroline expressing her disappointment, but accounts from the time describe her as being deeply disheartened. Her grand vision, her sweeping solution to the White House's problems, had been dismissed. But Caroline was not one to be defeated. If she couldn't rebuild the house, she would do everything in her power to improve it. She pivoted from grand architecture to practical, hands-on management. She rolled up her sleeves and began a thorough room-by-room campaign to modernize and restore the mansion. She ordered a complete cleaning, supervised the extermination of the rats, and had the floors replaced. She oversaw the installation of new modern bathrooms and, most famously, brought electricity to the White House. The Harrisons were actually terrified of the new technology and would often leave the lights on for fear of getting a shock from the switches, a charmingly human detail in the story of modernization. Perhaps her most lasting contribution, however, came from her love of history. While cleaning out the closets and storerooms, she discovered pieces of old presidential china, broken furniture, and forgotten artifacts from previous administrations. Horrified that the nation's history was being treated like junk, she initiated a project to collect and catalog everything. She began the White House China Collection, which is still a treasured part of the mansion's holdings today. This was a revolutionary act. Before Caroline Harrison, presidential furnishings were often sold off or given away at the end of an administration. She was the first to insist that these objects had historical value and belonged to the American people. She also designed her own state china service, featuring the goldenrod and corn, symbols of the American heartland. Her historical passion extended beyond the White House walls. In 1890, she lent her prestige and her name to the founding of a new organization for women descended from patriots of the American Revolution. She became the first President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR, an organization that remains a powerful force for historic preservation and patriotism to this day. And in a final, delightful touch that endeared her to the public, in 1889, she had the first documented Christmas tree placed in the White House, decorating it herself for her grandchildren. She was, in every sense, trying to make the White House a true American home. But as Caroline worked tirelessly to restore the nation's house, her own life was quietly falling into the shadow of a complex and painful drama. To understand it, we have to introduce a third person into the Harrison story, Caroline's niece, a young widow named Mary Scott Dimmock. Mary was the daughter of Caroline's sister, and after her own husband died, Caroline invited her to the White House in 1889. The reason was twofold. First, it was an act of familial kindness. Second, Caroline, whose health was never robust, needed help. Mary was to act as her social secretary, an assistant to help manage the crushing duties of the First Lady. Mary was younger, energetic, and capable, and she quickly became an indispensable part of the White House household. As Carolyn's public projects like the renovations and the founding of the DAR consumed her time and energy, Mary took on more and more of the day-to-day social responsibilities. She also worked closely with the president, helping him with his correspondence and social scheduling. President Harrison, a man often described as formal and even cold in public, developed a warm and affectionate rapport with his helpful young niece-in-law. Here is where the story becomes clouded by whispers and historical debate. In 1891, Caroline began to show symptoms of a serious illness. She was often tired, coughing, and weak. Her condition was eventually diagnosed as tuberculosis, a virtual death sentence in the 19th century. As her health declined, she was forced to withdraw more and more from public life. She traveled to the Adirondacks, hoping the mountain air would restore her, but the illness was relentless. During this period, as Caroline was fighting for her life, Mary Dimmock's role expanded even further. She became the de facto hostess of the White House, and her bond with President Harrison deepened. Washington society, always hungry for gossip, began to notice. They saw the president and his niece enjoying walks together, engaging in lively conversation and relying on each other for companionship. The whispers began. Was this relationship purely professional and familial, or was something more developing? This is the heart of the controversy. From one perspective, their closeness was perfectly understandable. Caroline was gravely ill. Benjamin was facing the immense stress of the presidency and the personal agony of watching his wife fade away. Mary was a source of comfort and a competent manager who kept the White House running. Their bond could be seen as one of shared grief and mutual support. But from another perspective, it was seen as a profound betrayal. The image of the president growing closer to a younger woman, his wife's own niece, while his wife was dying in a room down the hall, was for many deeply unsettling. There is no concrete evidence of a physical affair during Caroline's lifetime, but an emotional intimacy was clearly growing, one that blurred the lines between family, duty, and affection. We can only imagine the private pain this might have caused Caroline. Was she aware of the whispers? Did she sense the shifting dynamics in her own home? As a woman of immense pride and Victorian sensibilities, she left no record of her feelings on the matter. Her suffering was silent, hidden behind the closed doors of the White House sick room. This quiet, tragic drama adds a layer of profound pathos to Caroline's final years. She was a woman who had dedicated herself to creating the perfect American home, only to have her own home life become a source of quiet scandal and, one can only assume, deep personal sorrow. Caroline Harrison's life came to a tragic end in the very house she had fought so hard to save. Her battle with tuberculosis worsened throughout 1892. She died in the White House on October 25, 1892, at the age of 60. Her death cast a pall over the nation and brought the ongoing presidential campaign to a halt. Her grieving husband, Benjamin Harrison, was running for re-election against Grover Cleveland. Just 2 weeks after his wife's death, the nation went to the polls, and he lost. His presidency and the Harrison family's time in the White House ended in a shroud of mourning. The consequences of Caroline's tenure as First Lady are more significant than she is often given credit for. Her most profound legacy was her vision for the White House itself. Even though her grand architectural plans were rejected, she fundamentally changed the way the White House was perceived. She was the first First Lady to treat it not just as a temporary residence, but as a living museum, a repository of American history. Her meticulous project of cataloging the mansion's contents and preserving its historical artifacts laid the essential groundwork for all future preservation efforts. When Jacqueline Kennedy captivated the world with her famous White House restoration 70 years later, she was, in many ways, completing the project that Caroline Harrison had begun. She also helped modernize the role of First Lady by managing a major renovation, overseeing a large and complex household budget, and taking on a public leadership role as the head of the DAR. She demonstrated that the First Lady could be an effective executive and a powerful cultural advocate. She brought a new level of professionalism and purpose to the position. The sad controversy of her final years also had a lasting consequence. The whispers about Benjamin Harrison and Mary Dimmock were tragically confirmed, in the public's view, when the two were married in 1896, less than 4 years after Carolyn's death. This union caused a bitter rift in the Harrison family. The former president's adult children, Russell and Mary, who had adored their mother, were horrified by their father's decision. They refused to attend the wedding. The marriage cemented the narrative of a quiet betrayal, casting a long and complicated shadow over the memory of Benjamin Harrison's presidency and Caroline's final painful months. What can we learn from Caroline Harrison's story? We learn that history is often made not in the loud clashes of politics, but in the quiet, determined efforts of individuals to bring order, beauty, and dignity to their surroundings. We learn that even our most cherished national symbols are fragile, and they require dedicated champions to preserve them for future generations. Her story is a poignant reminder that public life is always intertwined with private pain, and that behind the stoic portraits of our historical figures are human beings grappling with love, loss, illness, and disappointment. Caroline Harrison entered the White House as a reluctant First Lady, a private woman thrust into the brightest of public spotlights. She found a home in decay and a role without a clear definition. She responded not with glamour or political maneuvering, but with the practical skills and quiet resolve she had cultivated over a lifetime. She fought to preserve the nation's past and to secure its future, all while navigating a heartbreaking personal ordeal. Though her grandest dreams for the White House went unfulfilled in her lifetime, her vision ultimately prevailed. She was a woman of quiet strength who left a legacy of enduring beauty and historical consciousness, reminding us that sometimes the most important work is simply the act of taking care of the house.